A man wakes up. No alarm clock. No sunlight. No sound except concrete breathing back at him. He doesn't know what day it is. He stopped counting months ago. Maybe years ago. The cell is 8 feet wide, 10 feet long, smaller than most people's bathrooms. A foam pad on a concrete slab. A steel toilet. 2 concrete cubes they call a desk and a chair. A steel door with perforated holes so thin you can barely see through it. He has been here for over 20 years. Not 20 days. Not 20 months. 20 years. Inside this box. Alone. No phone calls. No hugs. No sunlight touching his skin. The only human contact he's had is a guard sliding a tray through a slot. This is Pelican Bay State Prison Security Housing Unit. The SHU. Pronounced SHU. And for decades, it was the most extreme isolation experiment ever conducted on American soil, with over 500 people trapped inside it for more than 10 years at a time. The question the prison system never asked, the question nobody asked, was this: what happens to a human mind when you strip away everything that makes life human? And the bigger question, the one that will drive everything you're about to hear, is this: how did any of them survive it? That answer is stranger, more disturbing, and more remarkable than anything you'd expect. Stay with this, because by the end of this video, you won't look at the word isolation the same way again. If you've never seen a breakdown of what actually goes on inside the Pelican Bay SHU, subscribe right now and hit the bell. This channel covers the stories institutions don't want told. You don't want to miss what's coming in the next 30 minutes. Pelican Bay State Prison opened in 1989. Northern California, buried in a remote corner of Del Norte County, hours from anything resembling a city, surrounded by forest and fog. It was designed for one purpose: to warehouse the men California's prison system could not control anywhere else. The Security Housing Unit, the SHU, was the crown jewel of this philosophy. An X-shaped cluster of buildings sitting at the center of the prison like a concrete spider. Inside, 1,056 individual cells organized into 132 pods of 8 cells each. Every cell identical. Every prisoner isolated. Every door controlled remotely from a central booth where guards watched 6 pods at once through perforated steel. The cells were 8 feet by 10 feet. Inside, a concrete ledge with a foam pad. A steel toilet and sink combined into one fixture. 2 concrete cubes, one for sitting, one for writing. That was everything. No window to the outside. The only light came from fluorescent tubes overhead. Day and night looked the same. Prisoners spent 22.5 hours locked inside that box. The remaining 90 minutes, sometimes less, sometimes eliminated entirely, were spent alone in what was officially called the exercise yard. Prisoners called it the dog run. A bare concrete pen slightly larger than the cell. No sky, no grass, no other person. According to documented conditions reviewed by federal courts, prisoners at Pelican Bay's SHU were denied phone calls entirely. No contact visits with family. Only plexiglass separating them if visits happen at all, and the prison's location hundreds of miles from California's population centers meant most families couldn't come at all. There were no educational programs, no vocational training, no work assignments, nothing to mark the passing of time, except the fluorescent light that never changed. In 1993, journalist Mike Wallace visited Pelican Bay for 60 minutes and found prisoners already describing it as torture. Guards, according to documented court findings and inmate testimony, had in the early years beaten prisoners, organized staged fights between rival gang members, and, in one of the most disturbing documented incidents, subjected a mentally ill prisoner named Von Dorch to a bath in scalding water while handcuffed, leaving him with 2nd and 3rd degree burns. One of the guards present reportedly said, while Dorch's skin peeled away, "Looks like we're going to have a white boy before this is through." Federal courts eventually intervened over the physical brutality, but the isolation continued. And by the late 1990s and into the 2000s, the overt violence had largely been replaced by something quieter, something the courts found harder to see, something that worked from the inside out. The question wasn't whether the SHU was brutal, by any measurement, psychiatric, physiological, legal. The question was, How did a human being last 5, 10, 20, 30 years inside it and remain recognizably human? The answer begins with understanding what happens to a brain when you remove everything from it. Dr. Stuart Gracian, then a psychiatry professor at Harvard Medical School, interviewed dozens of Pelican Bay SHU inmates in the early 1990s. His conclusion, presented in federal court, was unambiguous. Isolation of this severity produces a specific psychiatric syndrome, now recognized by neuroscientists worldwide. Hypersensitivity to stimuli, perceptual distortions, hallucinations, paranoia, an inability to think clearly, random violent outbursts followed by catatonia, memory erosion, a dissolving sense of time. Gracian told Wallace that more than a third of the prisoners he examined were psychotic. And more disturbing, men who had no prior mental illness when they arrived developed it inside the SHU. The prison's own data, later cited in court proceedings, showed that SHU units comprise only 10% of California's prison cells. But more than 70% of the state's prison suicides took place in those units. This is the environment. This is the baseline. Now you need to understand the people who survived it and how they did it. The first survival mechanism was the most fundamental: structure. Without structure, documented psychiatric research shows the human mind cannot hold its shape in isolation. Time stops feeling real. The boundary between sleeping and waking blurs. Without external anchors, without schedules, appointments, people, seasons, the mind begins to drift. And drifting, in the SHU, could end in one of several documented ways: catatonic withdrawal, explosive rage, or suicide. The men who lasted years, the men who came out of the SHU intact enough to speak, to testify, to file lawsuits, almost universally described the same first strategy. They imposed their own time. They invented their own schedules. Wake at a specific hour. Exercise in a specific sequence. Eat at a specific pace. Write at a specific time. Read at a specific time. Sleep at a specific time. Not because anything required them to, because the alternative was formlessness, and formlessness was death. Caesar Villa, who spent more than 15 years in Pelican Bay's SHU after being placed there based on information from an anonymous informant, described his experience in documented testimony published in the anthology Hell is a very small place. He described the progression of his first weeks with precision. The first week, telling himself it wasn't that bad. The second week, standing in the dog run in his underwear in hail and rain, body shaking. The third week, squatting in a corner, filing his fingernails down against the coarse concrete wall because something, anything, had to occupy his hands. By the end of the first year, his feet and hands had begun to crack open from the cold. Villa survived by reading. Obsessively. Whatever was permitted. Prison censorship at Pelican Bay was documented as arbitrary and often capricious. One list of banned titles in California SHUs included books as unthreatening as the Mayo Clinic Family Health Book and the Penguin Book of Love Poetry. But what got through? Prisoners read and reread until the pages wore thin. Reading was time. Reading was another place. Reading was proof that a world existed beyond concrete. For Todd Ashker, who arrived at Pelican Bay in 1990 after being convicted of second-degree murder and labeled a gang affiliate, a designation he consistently denied, the survival mechanism was law. Ashker began teaching himself legal procedure from inside a windowless cell. Without library access, he could only request specific books and cases and hope officers would deliver them. Sometimes they did. Over years, working with scraps of legal paper and a stub pencil, Ashker educated himself well enough to file legal documents. The case he eventually filed, Ashker versus Brown, later Ashker versus Governor of California, will become one of the most consequential prison reform lawsuits in American history. He started it as a man with no law degree, no library, and 22.5 hours of solitude every day. Purpose kept him thinking. Thinking kept him from breaking. Gabriel Reyes, one of the plaintiffs in that same lawsuit, had been in the SHU for 16 years at the time he gave his testimony. Reyes had originally been sent to prison for burglarizing an unoccupied dwelling. Under California's three strikes law, He received a sentence of 25 years to life. He was then placed in solitary for alleged gang affiliation. In his documented statement, Reyes described the experience with the kind of specificity that only comes from having actually lived it. Unless you have lived it, you cannot imagine what it feels like to be by yourself between four cold walls with little concept of time, no one to confide in, and only a pillow for comfort for years on end. It is a living tomb. Reyes survived, in part, by writing letters. Even when they couldn't be sent easily. Even when they weren't answered. Writing organized thought. Writing required grammar, sequence, argument. Writing was a demand that the mind remain coherent. He described developing severe insomnia, frequent headaches, a sense of helplessness and hopelessness that he consciously fought every day. "I struggle not to fuel the problem," he wrote, "to keep my wits about me, even when I feel I may descend into madness." That struggle, that conscious, daily fight to remain a functioning human being despite everything the environment was designed to strip away, is documented across dozens of testimonies, court records, and psychiatric evaluations. It is not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. There was no single moment of triumph. It was just the same fight every day for years on end. The second survival mechanism was one the prison system never anticipated. And when officials discovered it, they tried to stop it. Communication. Inside the SHU, direct conversation between prisoners was officially forbidden. The doors were solid steel. The pods were designed to prevent prisoners from seeing or speaking to each other. When one prisoner was taken to the dog run, others were locked inside. The system was architected for atomization. Every man a separate, isolated unit with no means of reaching anyone else. But human beings are not designed for silence. And in the SHU, prisoners found the walls. Sound travels through concrete, through steel pipes, through the gaps around perforated doors. Prisoners learned to communicate by shouting from their cells in a code of timing and tone, keeping voices low enough to evade guards, loud enough to reach the cell next door. They shouted news. They shouted encouragement. They shouted arguments and jokes and information about legal rights. One documented instance involves a correctional officer named T. Brewer filing a formal disciplinary report, gang chrono, in 2012 against Todd Ashker for shouting from his cell to another prisoner. The chrono was placed in Ashker's permanent file as evidence of gang activity. The act of speaking to another human being had become official misconduct. Prisoners also developed a physical communication network documented in court records and journalist accounts. Notes written on small pieces of paper, called kites or fishing lines, passed beneath cell doors using threads pulled from clothing or towels. Photographs pulled from magazines. Pieces of art. Information about legal proceedings. Testimony that needed to reach lawyers outside the walls. One former SHU prisoner described, in a documented account, the elaborate physical choreography required to pass a single sheet of paper from one cell to another, a process that could take hours and risk disciplinary action if discovered. The most extraordinary documented example of this communication network is what became known as the Short Corridor Collective. Deep inside Pelican Bay's SHU was a section called the Short Corridor, fewer cells than the other wings, housing men the California Department of Corrections had identified as the highest-ranking leaders of the state's major prison gangs. The department's logic was containment. Put them all in one place and monitor them together. What the department did not predict was what would happen when men from violently opposed racial groups, men whose organizations had been killing each other for decades, found themselves sharing adjacent walls with nothing to do but think and talk. According to documented accounts from journalists, legal records, and the men themselves, Todd Ashker, Arturo Castellanos, Sidwa Nantambajama, and Antonio Guillen, representing white, Latino, and black prisoner factions, began communicating across the short corridor. At first about survival, then about shared conditions, then about shared demands. In August 2012, the Short Corridor Collective issued a formal written document, the Agreement to End Hostilities. It called on all prisoners across racial lines, in the SHU and general population alike, to cease racial violence. For men whose organizations had defined themselves by racial separation, it was a seismic shift. Legal scholars and civil rights organizations noted it was the most significant prisoner-led peace agreement in California prison history. They did this from solitary confinement, through walls, using the only tools the prison hadn't found a way to take: words, thought, and the refusal to stop being political beings. A book had helped catalyze it. According to accounts from the Short Corridor Collective and journalists who later covered their story, a copy of Nothing But an Unfinished Song, a biography of IRA hunger striker Bobby Sands, had circulated through the Short Corridor. The story of Sands, who died on hunger strike in the Maze prison in 1981 while fighting for political recognition, resonated with men who had no legal avenue left but their own bodies. In July 2011, over 6,000 California SHU prisoners went on hunger strike. It was the largest prison protest in California history. The strike was organized entirely by men in solitary confinement, men who technically couldn't speak to each other, men who had been stripped of every conventional means of collective action. They did it anyway. If what you're seeing here is making you think differently about solitary confinement, share this video right now. This channel exists to tell the stories the system buries. Hit subscribe and keep watching. What happens next is where the story gets even more complicated. The hunger strikes changed everything, and they changed nothing. Both things are simultaneously true. The first strike in July 2011 began with specific, documented demands from the Short Corridor Collective and the broader SHU population. 5 core demands: adequate food, an end to group punishment for individual behavior, permission to purchase more food and hygiene items from the prison commissary, access to educational programming, and, most critically, an end to the practice of indefinite SHU placement based solely on alleged gang affiliation. That last demand cut to the heart of why so many of these men were there in the first place. The system by which California placed prisoners in the SHU indefinitely was called gang validation, and the evidence required to validate a prisoner, to sentence them to potentially lifelong isolation without any crime committed inside prison, was shockingly thin. Documented cases include a prisoner appearing on a list of gang members found in another prisoner's cell, possessing culturally affiliated artwork or tattoos, using the word sobrino, Spanish for nephew, in a letter, reading about Black history, writing in Swahili. One prisoner spent 29 years in the Pelican Bay SHU, disciplined only once in that entire period for a minor rule violation, based on a validation as a gang member when he was a young man that he was never given a meaningful opportunity to challenge. The psychiatric expert retained by lawyers challenging the SHU in the Ashker lawsuit documented the effects systematically. The common complaints among long-term SHU prisoners were anger, anxiety, depression, insomnia, inability to concentrate, and, most significantly, a profound loss of the sense of time. Men who had been there for a decade struggled to recall seasons. Men who had been there for 2 decades described time as having compressed into an undifferentiated gray mass. One prisoner interviewed for journalist accounts described counting every human touch he experienced in 10 years in the SHU. The number was small enough to count. The 2011 hunger strike lasted several weeks. Over 6,000 prisoners participated. The state's initial response, according to documented accounts, was dismissive. A guard reportedly told the striking prisoners, "You want to starve yourselves to death, go ahead. Ain't shit gonna change." But attention was building outside the walls. Families, advocates, lawyers, journalists all began focusing on the SHU in ways the institution had successfully avoided for over 2 decades. The Center for Constitutional Rights joined the Ashker lawsuit in 2012. The case, which Todd Ashker and Danny Troxell had begun filing themselves from their windowless cells in 2009, now had institutional legal backing. A second hunger strike in September 2011. A third, larger strike in July 2013, this time involving over 30,000 prisoners across California's prison system, the largest prison hunger strike in the state's history. Prisoners starved themselves for weeks. Some were hospitalized. A federal court judge was eventually asked to issue an order allowing force-feeding of prisoners who had reached medical crisis points. Inside the SHU, the men who had organized the strikes faced a specific dilemma that no legal theory could fully resolve: holding on. The physical toll of hunger, striking in a body already weakened by years of minimal exercise, poor nutrition, cold, and stress was severe. But the psychological cost of not acting was, many described, worse. One documented testimony from Stryker described the choice as having reduced to a single calculation. The pain of resisting was easier to bear than the pain of acceptance. The state, meanwhile, was quietly beginning to acknowledge what it publicly denied. Internal documents and subsequent court evidence showed that California's prison officials knew, by at least the early 2000s, that the number of validated gang affiliates in the SHU was far outpacing any conceivable legitimate security need. Hundreds of men were isolated not because they were currently dangerous, but because the system had no off-ramp for them. Debriefing, providing information about gang members to the prison, was the only official pathway out. But debriefing made a prisoner a marked target in the general population. The documented choices, as prisoners and their advocates summarized them, were snitch, parole, or die. Hugo Pinel, one of 6 prisoners famous for a 1971 escape attempt at San Quentin, spent 43 years in long-term confinement, 23 of those in the Pelican Bay SHU. He was released from the SHU in 2015 under the terms of the Ashker settlement. 2 weeks later, he was stabbed to death in a riot at another California prison. The SHU had kept him alive for 23 years. The world outside, it killed him in 2 weeks. In August 2015, the state of California and the plaintiffs in Ashker versus Governor of California reached a settlement agreement. It was a legal earthquake. The settlement effectively ended California's practice of indefinite solitary confinement based on gang affiliation. It mandated that virtually all long-term SHU prisoners be reviewed and transferred out. It capped future solitary sentences at 5 years. It prohibited placing prisoners in isolation based on alleged gang affiliation alone. And it required that men who had spent more than a decade in the SHU be given immediate pathways back to general population. 1 year after the settlement took effect, the numbers were stark. The population held in the Pelican Bay SHU for more than 10 years had dropped by 99%. Over 1,500 prisoners who had been in some form of solitary confinement across California were reviewed. The overwhelming majority were transferred out. The men who had been buried alive, some for more than 2 decades, began to see the sky again. The accounts of those first moments outside the SHU are among the most documented and most difficult to read in the entire record of this case. Richard Wim Johnson, one of the Ashker plaintiffs, described the small things as the most overwhelming. Walking to a dining hall for breakfast, going to a classroom, having physical contact with another human being. After years in which the sum total of human touch was a guard placing handcuffs on his wrists, the experience of an ordinary handshake was documented as destabilizing. One released SHU prisoner described his first encounter with birds after decades inside as so startling it took him several minutes to process what he was seeing. Another, running through a snowstorm, described it as the closest thing to joy he had experienced in 20 years. But re-entry, even into general population, let alone society, was not simple. The psychiatric damage documented in court records was real and persistent. Former SHU prisoners consistently showed the syndrome Dr. Gracian had identified decades earlier: hypersensitivity, difficulty concentrating, a broken internal sense of time, and a pervasive inability to process social stimulation after years without it. The crowding of general population, the noise, the movement, the presence of dozens of other bodies, was experienced by many as overwhelming after years of absolute silence. The question that legal scholars, mental health professionals, and journalists who covered the Ashker settlement continue to raise was this: what had been done to these men could not be undone simply by opening a door. Years of the human mind eating itself in silence produced changes that were structural embedded in how the brain had reorganized itself to survive. Some of those changes were documented, clinicians observed, permanent. And yet, and this is the part the system never fully accounted for, some of what came out of those years was not only damage. The men of the Short Corridor Collective had, from solitary confinement, organized the largest prison protest in California history. They had filed and won one of the most consequential prison civil rights lawsuits of the 21st century. Todd Ashker had done it from a windowless cell with a stub pencil and books officers sometimes chose not to deliver. Sidiwa Nantambujama had done it from a cell where writing in Swahili was documented as evidence of gang activity. Gabriel Reyes had done it while describing himself as fighting every single day not to descend into madness. The survival strategies, structure, reading, writing, the forbidden communication through walls, had not just kept these men alive. They had made them, in some documented and measurable sense, formidable. Karamet Writer, a scholar whose book on Pelican Bay became a foundational text in understanding the SHU, observed that the men she interviewed inside the unit were among the most well-read, most intellectually engaged, and most politically sophisticated people she had ever encountered anywhere. Not despite the years of enforced idleness and isolation, because of what they had chosen to do with it. That is not a justification for what was done to them. Not remotely. The courts have been clear. The United Nations has been clear. The psychological and medical consensus is unambiguous. Long-term solitary confinement causes severe, lasting harm. Full stop. But within that harm, buried inside the wreckage the SHU made of these men's bodies and minds, was something the institution had not engineered and could not control. The survival instinct of the human mind at its most reduced and most resourceful. When everything was taken, time, company, sunlight, touch, certainty, hope, some of these men made something out of nothing. And in doing so, they changed the law. The SHU still exists. Solitary confinement in American prisons still exists in dozens of states and hundreds of facilities under different names and different rules. The Ashker settlement covers California. It does not cover the country. And the question that Pelican Bay raised, and that no court has yet fully answered, is whether a society that claims to value human dignity can continue to use isolation as a permanent tool of punishment. The men who survived the SHU have spent years trying to make the rest of us confront that question. Most of us still haven't answered it. If this story changed how you see solitary confinement, share it. Right now, the people who live this deserve to have the world understand what actually happened inside those walls. Subscribe to this channel. We cover the cases and the systems that shape the world most people never see. The next video covers another institution that has operated in the dark for decades. You will not want to miss it.